So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is part of a conference on democracy at risk. This is part of the program of the IWM with the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. This is part of the CEFRI program funded by the Swiss government. It's a pleasure to welcome and to introduce my colleague, David Sylvan, to whom I owe a deep debt of gratitude because he took over the research office from me at the Graduate Institute, and which means I have one responsibility, which he's taking care of. The topic of his talk is Too Much Loyalty, the Uneasy Coexistence of Democracy and Foreign Policy, and the topic unites several of David's interests, among them international relations, democratic theory, foreign policy, and his work on the Garrison State project. Let me say something very briefly about each of these in turn. David Sylvan is professor of international relations at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. He's my colleague, as I just said. He had taught before he came to Geneva at the University of Minnesota and at Syracuse University. International political economy has been the focus of his research since many years, and also international relations theory, particularly the rules of the Westphalian system. Foreign policy analysis, which will go into some of the work which he will share with us today. Interestingly, he's one of the few people, I think, in his field who uses both very sophisticated qualitative methods and marries them with quantitative methods, computational modeling, etc. The Garrison State project, which he leads at the Institute, explores Lasswell's theory of the Garrison State. This is something that he probably will allude to a little later, so I'm not going to expound on this. But I just want to remind you, because David is going to speak without a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to give you the website of the Garrison State project, and that is www.garrisonstateproject.com for those of you who would like to look at some of the research results, especially because it is not only that it's produced interesting results, but the methodology is equally interesting. So that may be of interest, so especially the political scientists here in the room. David's first book was a rationalist methodology for the social sciences, published in 1985. And his latest is on US foreign policy. It's called US Foreign Policy in Perspective, Clients, Enemies, and Empire. David, you have the word, and you can choose to sit there if that's more comfortable, or come up here.
I'll stand up. Thank you very much. Let me put this here. I have some notes. Well, thank you very much, Shalini. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm both flattered and a little bit alarmed. And I hope that one won't dominate too much over the other. So, one of the issues that's come up repeatedly, especially in the last 12 months, since the election of he who shall not be named in the United States, is the issue about threats to democracy. I think the very workshop that we're having here is indicative of this concern. One can, if you do Google searches on this, find literally millions of hits, from blog posts to academic publications to any number of speeches from different people about the way in which in different countries, by no means just the United States, people are becoming quite alarmed about threats to democracy. And I don't claim a particular expertise on this, but I do want to say that there has been, in a sense, a kind of some holes in the discussion, and I want to try to fill in a few of those holes today. And I want to start out, if I may, with some references to some of the kinds of things that were actually talked about at the end of the preceding session. And that is to start by distinguishing between the standard way in which intellectuals, by no means just scholars, but intellectuals have for hundreds, arguably thousands of years been talking about threats to democracy on the one hand, and then threats, as I'll describe a little later, to republics on the other hand. And I want to make a distinction right away between democracies and republics, even though in practice, in our day and age, these are considered as relatively close to each other. The threats, as I think you all know much better than me, the threats to democracy that people have talked about tend to fall into what political scientists would call attitudinal threats on the one hand, and on the other hand, threats about incompetence. Attitudinal threats, of course, one of the things that one sees quite often and very early on is the notion that by giving democracy, giving power to the people, this runs the risk of intolerance. There's a lengthy literature going back, obviously, to the ancient Greeks, but in particular, one sees a lot of the work that's gone on in political psychology in the last several decades, work about the so-called right-wing authoritarian personality, and work on populism as concerned with this. The idea that if you give suffrage and give some control over the institutions of state to certain classes of people who don't have the same tolerant values of their betters, to use the Greek term, this is the kind of thing that's by itself dangerous. There's obviously specific versions of this. One of the individuals before mentioned, and I'd already put down in my notes, Madison, my reference would be Madison Federalist number 10, but one can pick one's own favorite Federalist papers about the dangers of the tyranny of the majority, and the way in which certain types of factions might use the fact that they have a majority of votes to try to do things that would actually destroy the underlying normative basis of democracy. So there's a series of attitudinal concerns about democracy in terms of people's attitudes. There's also, as I said, a concern about incompetence. And this goes back again in ancient Greece. If you remember in the Republic, Plato has this famous metaphor of the incompetent ship captain who doesn't really know what he's doing, and is, as it were, in terms of his personality, is blown back and forth by the whims of the crew, and that this is what a democracy is like. But in fact, one has any number of other types of works that have said that people may not necessarily be incompetent in the sense of not being able to run government, but they run it with a certain bias that will actually end up having really bad consequences. So one of the most infamous versions of this is the quite famous, as I would call him, anti-democrat Samuel Huntington, who starting in the 1950s, but then going up really to the end of his life, inveighed on a regular basis against democracy. He tended to have a particular fixation with the Tudor dynasty in England, as you may recall. And one of the things that he became famous for, or infamous depending on your point of view, was some writing starting in the late 60s, early 70s. There was this piece called The Democratic Distemper, which popularized ideas carried out that others had done, like James Buchanan, arguing that if you really let the wrong people vote, they would vote to increase welfare state payments, and they would bankrupt the state. And this is another version that the people are incompetent. So the threats to democracy, the way that literature, those literatures usually work, is focusing, as I said, on attitudes or incompetence. On the other hand, there is a second very interesting set of literatures that I think we tend to underplay to some degree just because we don't think of them quite in the same regard. And this is the literatures on threats to republics. And this is a trope in letters going back for centuries. You can already find it to some degree in some of the speeches of Cicero just before he got killed. One can find it in any number of other kind of classical writings. So I was going to read you a little bit, for example, from Machiavelli. and Machiavelli's discourses on Titus Livius, where he says, and forgive the antique translation, "For the further away the Romans sent their armies from Rome, so much more did such prolongations appear necessary, and the more they employed them. This caused two evils. The one, that a smaller number of men were given experience in the command of armies, and because of this reputation came to be restricted to a few. The other, that a citizen being in command of an army for a long time, he gained it over to himself and made it his partisan, so that the army in time forgot the Senate and recognized him as chief." And there's a lengthy discussion about the way in which republics tend to be particularly likely to be undermined by means of continual foreign or other kinds of wars. Another example, which one can get from Madison himself, and I don't remember which particular Federalist paper this comes from. "In time of actual war, great discretionary powers are constantly given to the executive magistrate. Constant apprehension of war has the same tendency to render the head too large for the body. A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty." And so this concern that standing armies, as opposed to some type of militia, the standing armies represented an incipient and structural threat to the continued survival of republics, is a trope that's been around for a very long time. But it's not just the concern about that's considered a problem, the way that the military might, in effect, start undermining the Republican institutions. You also get that this can become a problem not so much because there's a standing military, but just because when people are scared, when they're fearful, when they're afraid, they actually are willing to give up all types of controls. And this is, again, a very standard trope. Since Shalini was kind enough to mention the project I have on the Garrison State, I thought I would read from Mr. Garrison State himself, Harold Laswell, his wonderful 1941 article, which if you haven't read it before, I recommend to you. If you haven't reread it for a few decades, it's worth looking at again. And he says in inimitable Laswellian style, since he was an absolutely atrocious writer, the hypothesis is put forward in this brief article that the final act of war is likely to be less perilous than perpetual preparation for war. Perpetual crisis is likely to reverse the trend of historical development from progress toward a world commonwealth of free men toward a world order in which the garrison-prison state reintroduces caste-bound social systems. And at one point, Laswell even has a discussion about what he calls the significance of plebiscitary democracies and the way in which a continual appeal to the ballot box will, in the case of unscrupulous executives, be able thereby to prey upon the fear of fellow citizens to basically weaken Republican institutions. And so we have, therefore, as a rough analog to these two threads in terms of threats to democracy, we also have two historical threads of argument about threats to republics. And what I want to do in this talk this evening is to try to pull these together. Not that I have a terribly sophisticated argument, but I want to try to put them together, and I want to talk about the way in which we can, as it were, update some of the types of things that are talked about in terms of threats to republics, and see the way in which they have actually implications for democracy, the survival or lack thereof of democracy. And that's what I'm concerned with here tonight, the way that we can take these two, as it were, streams and cross them and put them together. And what I want to do to start out with is to give you a kind of stylized account. As our friends, the economists, like to talk about it. They talk about stylized facts a lot, I've discovered. And so I want to give you some stylized facts, or as economists themselves talk about it with no apparent trace of reflexive irony, I'm going to tell you some stories. And so I want to start out with a particular story, not really a just so story, but a story about the way in which we can talk about what's going on at the very moment that democracy is beginning to take root and to spread. And I'm talking about the 19th century. And I'm talking about the fact that in the 19th century, as you all know, is the era in which you begin to get significant expansion of the suffrage. So you have obviously the reform bills, multiple reform bills in Britain. But you also have, at the same time, the Jacksonian reforms in the United States that basically abolish property requirements in terms of voting. And you have analogous changes in other countries. Now, obviously, that doesn't end there. And by the beginning of World War I, by some estimates, you're up to about 80% of the adult males who are eligible to vote actually, who of the correct age actually are given the franchise. Of course, that's males. And so you don't get females given you don't get women given the vote until after World War I is over, or if it's France, after World War II is over, or as the country I've been living in for a number of decades. Now, Switzerland is the case not until 1971. But nonetheless, this is a kind of portrait of the way in which the franchise expands. And as the franchise expands, of course, at the same time, one also gets increase in the, what we might call the more specific procedural mechanisms, so that apart from this famous Rousseauian moment, his critique of Hobbes, that he said that the English were free once every 5 years for 10 minutes when they voted. Apart from that moment of voting, one would also get, therefore, as well, increase in democracy in terms of democratic rights by having things like state institutions becoming more transparent, publishing accounts regularly, submitting certain propositions to general commentary, having appeal possibilities built in terms of the legal system, and in various ways having democracy with a small d. And so what one has is a story that basically can be said to start around the early 19th century, and then going into the last, up until at least a few decades after World War II. Now, the problem with that story is that it's true up to a point, but only up to a point. And it's not true to a great degree when it comes to any number of issues having to do with war and peace. That is to say, some of the kind of so-called high politics issues in foreign policy. Now, I want to be careful what I'm saying. I'm not claiming that there are no issues of war that are ever debated democratically. Okay, in fact, I'm going to argue quite the contrary. My point, rather, is that that represents the tip of the iceberg, and all kinds of other decisions which are binding, or to use an infamous definition of politics from decades ago, are authoritatively allocating values. All kinds of other decisions are actually never make it into Parliament or into the public eye there. And here I would refer to the fact, to start out with, as in the wonderful book of Arno Meyer, about the Ancien Regime at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the way in which the control of the military and of foreign policy is usually, in most European countries, a matter of a relatively small clique of people who are aristocrats. Obviously, monarchs would count as aristocrats. Almost always aristocrats, entitled, including, by the way, in the ostensible republic, namely France, where you have lots of people with particles in their names running things at a high level there. And you have this kind of thing in which Parliament is only rarely and episodically informed, mostly at the point of actually having to vote credits. And as we know very well, if Parliament is back against the wall, it's very difficult not to vote credits. Now, even in the United States, which is, of course, a country in those days without a real aristocracy, at least an aristocracy of birth, what one has is that the very fact that the Congress meets quite infrequently, it would meet for only a few months a year for most of the 19th century, means that de facto all kinds of power is in practice that of the president, that the Congress has relatively little power having to do with even fairly significant matters of war and peace. So that, for example, the dissident members of Congress complained bitterly about the way that President Polk, for example, pulled the United States into war with Mexico by basically making it appear that the only way Congress could not declare war was if they were willing to have a slap in the face. And one finds similarly that the kind of manipulation of events is a very classic kind of thing that occurs over and over and over. So my point is that already you have a whole swath of very important issues on public policy that are, as it were, set apart, and that are, of course, to a significant degree, they're secret. I would refer to you the famous Tacitus phrase, arcana imperii, and that's exactly what actually happens in many cases. Things are not considered the kind of fit for significant public discussion there. Now, that's occurring at the same time as the suffrage is advancing, and at the same time as more and more procedures are being put in that would, technically speaking, widen democracy. And by the same token, there is a second tendency that also counteracts this generalization of the suffrage, and that's the development of modern forms of propaganda. I mean, it's striking to me that Lasswell wrote his doctoral dissertation on propaganda in what they were then calling the Great War. If you look at the development of the yellow press, for example, if you look at even the development of phrases such as jingoism, if you look at the kind of hysteria connected with the Boer War, if you look a few decades later, right after the armistice at the famous or infamous khaki election of 1918 in the UK, what you find over and over and over is that it's possible very easily to use the then cutting edge of the media in terms of the press especially, to whip up hysteria there. I would recall to you that the highly civilized, developed European states at the beginning of World War I, when finally the kind of melodrama about the exchanges back and forth, the Nicky Willy telegrams and all that were over, when Edward Grey had issued his self-satisfied comments about the lights going out all over Europe after he'd been pushing very hard for the lights to go out, and so forth, there was a massive level of popular support for these wars. Men flocked to the recruiting stations. They flocked to join. There was, of course, the famous vote of the Social Democrats in Germany for war credits that Lenin so bitterly denounced. There was massive scenes of enthusiasm in every European capital city that thought that, yes, we're going to go to war. And that testifies to me the significance of the way in which over and over and over you have the press and you have the media more generally in terms of things like campaign posters and recruitment posters and so forth, operating almost in tandem with the tight control over the actual decision making on matters of war and peace. So already, even as democracy is advancing, one has at the same time some countercurrents that are going on. Democracy is advancing, but it's advancing within a particular bounds. It's not advancing with regard to matters of war and peace. And this continues, of course, past World War I. It continues well into the interwar period. One thinks again of the innovations, if you want to use that term, of propaganda in the 1920s and especially the 1930s. And I don't just mean the radio, I also mean films, moving images of different sorts. And that's important as well. I can tell another story, but it would take too long because it's a more gossamer thread about the development of surveillance techniques. The only version I would tell right now is that in the 20s and 30s, faced with the mounting of what turn out to be independence movements in many colonies, various metropolitan regimes in the colonies actually set up surveillance policing systems, which subsequently, after decolonization, are then repatriated back to the metropole. But you get some of the innovations in surveillance really taking off for the first time in the 20s and 30s. So my point is that the first chapter of the story, if you will, the once upon a time part of it, is the type of thing that happens up until let's say 1945. Now, that's, as it were, the precursor. But after 1945, things really start to develop in a much more rapid fashion than before. And I want to go over some of these points there because it turns out that it's actually It's actually a somewhat complicated kind of argument. So the first thing to be pointed out is that in many states, obviously the United States is the kind of leading one, but this is also picked up on to a lesser degree in other states, and as I'll argue later, has then been copied quite sedulously by other states. You have a proliferation, I use the term deliberately, of all kinds of organizations connected with national security. So to start out with, in the United States, up until the end of World War II, there was no Defense Department. There was a Department of War, which included, by the way, the then Army Air Corps, before it was the Air Force, and the Department of the Navy. And there was no love lost between them, not that they're buddy-buddy now. They were separate cabinet departments. This was actually similar to many European states. It's what happens after the war that's significant, because they're then unified into a Defense Department, or in other places a Defense Ministry and so forth. And moreover, that unification comes with a series of other agencies that are invented. The most notorious one in the United States is the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, this of course is a question of learning from Pearl Harbor and of learning from what was considered to be the number of disasters that had happened in the preceding decades when intelligence was not centralized and was not unified. Although it's quite striking to me as a student of bureaucracy that the CIA was set up to unify certain kinds of intelligence, but the unification did not involve, for example, Army signal intelligence or Navy signal intelligence, and Navy signal intelligence were the ones that actually broke the Japanese code at Pearl Harbor. And so that tells you that to what degree this was something that was a genuine attempt to learn from the past, and to what degree it was, to use a modern and anachronistic term, security theater. It was both of these kind of things. But the CIA is set up, and the CIA, interestingly, is set up as an autonomous executive agency. It's not part of the Defense Department. It's certainly not part of the State Department. It's autonomous. And it reports in practice only to the President. On top of that, you had the National Security Council set up. And the National Security Council is, of course, just an advisory body, but to have a National Security Council with certain people being statutory members, one needs someone to shuffle the paper to arrange for the meetings, who is the National Security Advisor, and the National Security Advisor these days has a staff, the NSC staff, that's well over 100 people. Some of the illustrious national security advisors have been people like McGeorge Bundy, Walt Rostow, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and others. So already you have agencies set up. But that's, again, just the start, because in the following years, other agencies are set up. So, of course, you are now all familiar in the post-Snowden era with the National Security Agency, which is the code-busting unit. That was set up in the 1950s. There were a number of other institutions set up, which I'm not going to bother boring you in terms of all the technical names, but there was a proliferation of agencies, first of all in the United States, and then subsequently, as I said, it gets copied elsewhere, by which national security is actually going to be dealt with. And those agencies, of course, have budgets. They have personnel. And the budgets get voted, as I'll point out later on, they get voted year after year. And the personnel almost never diminish. This is what political scientists call a ratchet effect. It gets bigger, and when threats apparently die down, they don't go back to where they were before. They stay the same level, maybe decline epsilon, but then they go back up again the next time around. A ratchet, similar if you've ever been fishing in terms of the way that a reel might work. So you have, first of all, this incredible proliferation of agencies. And to give you a flavor of what this looks like now, and of course I'm now mixing apples and oranges because I'm talking about something that's the current day, not back in the 1940s. What one has, for example, there was a wonderful study that came out about 7 years or so ago by the Washington Post. It's called, you can still Google it, you can find it's called Top Secret America. And the numbers, and I've now looked at these numbers many times, okay, so I'm familiar with them. Even so, I find myself involuntarily gasping when I see some of these. So just to give you a flavor of how big this has become. In the United States, as of 2010, some 1,271 government agencies and 1,931 private companies work on programs related to counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence in about 10,000 locations across the United States. An estimated, this is the one I like the best, an estimated 854,000 people, which is about 1.5 times the size of the population of Washington, D.C. 854,000 people hold top secret security clearances. I want you to think about that for a second. I don't know what kind of a secret can be shared by almost 1 million people, but it's an interesting question. In Washington and the surrounding area, 33 building complexes for top secret intelligence work are under construction or have been built just since September 2001. Together, they occupy the equivalent of almost 3 Pentagons, 17 million square feet of space. There are 51 federal organizations and military commands operating in 15 U.S. cities that track the flow of money to and from terrorist networks. And in terms of reports published, there are an average of 50,000 intelligence reports published every year. So, on the good side, you might say it's impossible for them to keep track of it. But on the bad side, you might say it's impossible for them to keep track of it, okay? It's very, very hard to keep track of this kind of thing, which raises the question as to who's doing what to whom. Now, obviously, if you go back to the 1940s, you don't have that same size. You're dealing with something which is much smaller, but already it goes up rapidly. There's some key moments in when it goes up, okay? So, for example, those of you who know about the history of U.S. diplomacy will recall reading about the famous NSC 68. NSC 68 was technically speaking a dead letter, but it didn't matter because what it succeeded in doing with the Korean War, helping out, was a massive increase in U.S. military spending that reversed the relative demobilization of the preceding several years. Now, the United States doing this kind of thing, as I said, you have additional agencies created, and then this continues. So, for example, in the late 1960s, the Justice Department gets its own paramilitary organization, the Drug Enforcement Administration. And that, you might imagine, is a few narcs who are simply flying around doing some kind of daring do, but actually has become a quasi-combat type of operation. In, for example, Colombia and other places in Latin America, it was really, really quite active there. The CIA was doing things. The military then spun off their own special forces. The military themselves got bigger and bigger and bigger. So what I'm saying is that you take the preceding situation, you add to it, and now you have something that looks really organizational. And in my view, that is actually very, very significant, the organization. You take the organization and you take the secrecy together, and it's really quite a toxic mix there. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that it turns out that, as I mentioned in passing a few minutes ago, you can't get this growth on a year after year after year basis in at least a republic, if not a democracy, without the legislature regularly voting a budget for this, okay? Can't happen. Trump is finding out himself that he can't simply wave a magic wand, that all kinds of things in this regard have to go through the legislature. And of course, that's true not just of the United States, but of many, many other places. And so what you have, therefore, is, to a great degree, the fact that for this to continue, there has to be, to a very significant degree, there has to be continued buy-in by the legislature. I want to say that again. In order for these organizations to have established in the first place, to continue being funded year after year, to grow, because as I said, they almost never shrink, okay? To use some of the standard operating procedures over and over and over, there has to be buy-in, there has to be regular approval. Parenthetical note, anyone wants to do research on this, it's impossible to actually figure out the budget because the budget's secret. You can get overall budgets. You cannot get intelligence budgets in almost any country. They're deliberately dissimulated in nooks and crannies in literally dozens and dozens of fake budget categories for other agencies. The actual debates take place behind closed doors. The numbers are not published at all. Every so often, the U.S. government will let slip what the total budgetary authority is for all of what they love to call the U.S. intelligence community. Okay? The community, and they give you a number which tells you nothing about how much goes for this agency, for that agency, much less for certain kind of operations. We don't even know the number of employees and so forth. So, but my point is this, from everything we've seen, the numbers don't go down. And that means there's buy-in, and that means, among other things, there is, to use a term that we talked about before, there's a significant degree of elite consensus. Parenthetically, that's the basis for the project that I've got. That's how we're trying to track these things, is by looking at growth in consensus over time, and there are some technical ways in which we're coding parliamentary speeches to do this. I'd be happy to talk about that later on if it's relevant, but at this point it's a sidelight of a sidelight. In any case, my point is that in order to get this buy-in, you have to have members of parliament regularly going along with this, and not just going along with it in the sense of voting yes, but agreeing that some things really should not be talked about. So there's all these stories in various countries of what's supposed to be oversight, which is a complete sham, in which there will be extremely infrequent oversight hearings, in which people will be brought to testify. There will be ritualistic denunciations of them for some particular peccadillo, but it doesn't have any particular significance there, and things go on as they had been before. So there is, technically speaking, oversight, but in practical matters there is no real oversight. So you have votes year after year, and you have this other kind of thing. And indeed, it's worth noting, this is very important, members of parliament in any democratic country could, if they wanted to, they have the legal power, through the power of the purse, to cut down or to change drastically this archipelago that's been built up. They don't do it not because they don't know about it, because they actually agree with it. And they don't want to know certain details because that would be embarrassing, but they tend to agree in others. And why? Well, when we code speeches, one of the things we find over and over is a sense of fear, a pervasive sense of fear. Indeed, what I would say, if I can be a little cutesy, is that what one has is an over and over an incredible sense on the part of political elites of loyalty to the state. Loyalty to the state to protect security. And that loyalty, we can say, is in effect, from my perspective, it's fear reinforcing organization. And I like that phrase. Loyalty is fear reinforcing organization. I thought it's a kind of cute phrase. But it's the kind of thing that I think actually gets at quite deeply what's going on there. One has something that's ideological, that's a buy-in by elites, and it works through the fact that they see the world, as they tell you over and over, as very threatening, and that therefore they're willing to support organizations. Now there's other things that go on as well, okay? And one of the things that goes on, which from a democratic point of view is actually extremely worrisome, is the fact that because there's buy-in and because there's relatively little oversight and there's relatively little debate, therefore what happens is that all kinds of issues don't work the way they're supposed to work in terms of Robert Dahl-style democratic theory, okay? What would imagine happening is that people have preferences, right? The preferences get translated in terms of political parties, or as political scientists like to call them, interest aggregation engines, into some kinds of platforms or manifestos or promises, and in turn the election's fought on those bases, and then if they get to power, they will actually act on those promises. In the case of issues about war and peace, almost none of that works. To start out with, there is a very, very high level of ignorance on the part of the general public, to put it mildly. The public, by the way, is not terribly concerned currently about these issues. I actually pulled up today the latest Gallup polls in the United States for the question they're asked literally every month, what according to you is the most important problem facing the country today? And by the way, you can do similar analyses using Eurobarometer for various countries in Europe, and you come up with roughly similar kinds of things, although there's, of course, country-specific things. So, 5% in October, okay, just last month, said the biggest problem was the economy. 5% said it was unemployment. In terms of non-economic problems, this is how Gallup calls it, 20% said it was dissatisfaction with government/poor leadership. I think we know what that means. 14% it was race relations, okay, which this was after the affair of football players kneeling and after the Charlottesville incidents. 11% said unifying the country, so that is to say most of the concerns were about Trump. And then 7% about health care. The first foreign policy issue is the situation with North Korea, 5% worried about. Immigration, illegal aliens, 5%. Then we get down to, quote, international issues and problems, whatever that means, 3%. War, unspecified. Fear of war, 2%. Terrorism, 2%. National security, 2%. Now, if you look at polling data going back for decades, you find that once in a while, for example, during a war, that there are blips in interest. We know that. It's predictable. There's the so-called rally around the flag effect. If there is some high-profile event, people tend to get very concerned about that. But most people don't seem to care very much about it. And one of the reasons they don't care very much about it is that, for the most part, the number of news items, to the extent they follow the news, about that is, again, relatively small. Who does care about it? Well, what does care about it? The elites. And I want to stress this because we were talking earlier today about the question of attitudes, and we were talking about what people believe. One of the things that's quite striking, if you look at the work in political psychology the last decade or so, is that most people, and this goes back actually to the 1960s, but we now have really very strong results in lots of countries. Most people are ignorant about most issues. They don't have strong opinion. And in fact, it's not that people have beliefs and then they say, oh, which party or which candidate best fits with my beliefs. That just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in any country that we know of. Okay, I want to say that again. It doesn't happen in any country we know of, that people start out with clear beliefs, look around the landscape, the political landscape, for a particular party or candidate or movement that best represents them, that they're closest to, and then support that candidate. Instead, what happens is that because of affect and emotion, and because of almost tribal identification, people start out identifying with a party or a candidate. Then, after the fact, adopt the ideas and the beliefs of that party or candidate. And there's enormous amount of psychological evidence showing this. There's a subfield having to do with what's called motivated reasoning, the way that people's beliefs are actually motivated by emotions. But much more generally, ordinary people do not have clearly formed beliefs about most issues. They tend to take their lead from the people, from the leaders or the parties that they support, and that's why it's perfectly possible for people who call themselves conservatives, let's say in the United States, to go from being desperately worried about Russia to saying, well, what's the problem? Putin's a good guy. And this kind of thing happens over and over and over in lots and lots of countries. So what that says, therefore, to go back to the broader issue, is that when we are talking about the question of where does all this kind of thing come from, what we're talking about is fear on the part of elites. And the various surveys that have been carried out in the United States with the Congress, in the UK with the Parliament there, in other European countries with their respective parliaments, show that members of Parliament are much more concerned about a dangerous world than their constituents are. And so what you have is this beautiful loop in which organizations tend to be supported by MPs, and they're supported by MPs in part because it's the only game in town, and in part because the MPs are scared. And the fear goes on for years and years and years, even when one might say, what is exactly the problem going on right now? That comes up over and over and over. It's one of the strongest kind of findings that we actually have there. Now, to go back to the main point that I was getting at, what we therefore have is that this kind of mechanism is already in place by the late 40s, early 1950s. It's then It's then continually spurred throughout the 50s by the various nuclear confrontations and crises, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it goes up through the 1970s. It does diminish to some degree in terms of levels of fear, but only to some degree. It's spiked up again when Reagan becomes president. You remember that not only was Reagan petrified about the Soviet Union, but at the same time, in terms of the affair of the Pershing missiles in Germany, he petrified a lot of other people about the prospect of nuclear war. And one has very high levels of concern there. So that finally, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism, at that point, you have very large agencies, security agencies in multiple countries. And those agencies, even though there's no particular threat on the horizon, no one's seriously talking about dismantling them. Those of you who are old enough to remember, back in the end of the 80s, early 90s, there was actually talk, remember this? There used to be something called a peace dividend. It didn't last very long. It didn't last very long because luckily Saddam Hussein came along in the first Gulf War, and that more or less took this off. And then when there was another talk about cutting budgets, Milosevic came along, and so as a result, there were sufficient levels, not necessarily of major fear, but of fear to say it's the prudent thing not to dismantle these organizations. And so my point is that this syndrome of a kind of interaction cycle between fear on the one hand and organizational momentum on the other, which I would say is the kind of crystallization of loyalty, this actually goes on for decades. Comes the third part of the story, which unfortunately is not living happily ever after, and that's the post-9/11 period. Now, if you look at the post-9/11 period, one of the things that's interesting is that, of course, there's additional agencies created. There's very high levels of fear about terrorist attacks among many, many political elites. And this works in all kinds of ways. So it means not only do organizations continue to grow in size in terms of budgetary authority, numbers of employees, scope of activities, scale of activities, geographical reach, and so forth, you begin to get even more intensive levels of coordination between different countries' agencies than you had before. Already back in the 80s, and to some degree even in the 70s, you get, for example, collaboration not just at the level of militaries, but of intelligence agencies. The famous Five Eyes thing you may have read about, in which a number of English-speaking countries actually have systematic coordination of intelligence operations, has been around for a number of decades. It's interesting, by the way, that after Angela Merkel discovered that the NSA was listening to her phone conversations, she sent her national security advisor, because of course the Germans, the French, the others now all have national security advisors, right? Her guy to Washington, not to scream about how terrible this was, but ask if he could be the sixth eye. And that tells you something about the extent to which there is an enormous amount of de facto, under the radar coordination that goes on. You also have many of the US innovations in terms of things such as surveillance, for certain forms of electronic tracking of people, the use of private companies being picked up on by all kinds of other countries. So one of the papers that I've gone through multiple drafts of, just because we have data that keep getting updated, we have a footnote, I'm embarrassed to say, on the first page, which is basically taken over the first page, is well into the second page, and it simply is listing the latest European or non-European countries that actually have taken over have actually, is this it? Okay, that have actually used enacted legislation similar to the USA Patriot Act. Okay, they've literally taken the phrasing, the wording of the Patriot Act, and they've actually implemented in a number of countries. The prolonged states of emergency in France after the Bataclan attacks, the so-called Snoopers Warrant, Snoopers Charter, I should say, in the United Kingdom. Analogous legislation even in Switzerland now. Obviously not as significant, but that still has passed. Legislation in Japan. So one has de facto coordination. You have more and more countries creating analogous kinds of agencies that are going on. And indeed, the interesting thing is that this works not only at the international level, the interstate level, but it also works domestically. So that you may remember that after 9/11, one of the policies that the George Bush Jr. administration had was to take surplus military equipment and distribute it to local police agencies in little out-of-the-way towns and hamlets that no one had ever thought was a target for Al-Qaeda before. Okay, and they would be given SWAT team things, they would be given special tactical body armor, they would be given all kinds of sophisticated equipment, the kind of thing that they could call in an airstrike if they wanted to. And it turns out that this is the kind of thing that over and over and over was done, which meant that there began to be a kind of connection between foreign terrorist fighting and domestic policing. And that same thing has happened in other countries because, like bureaucrats anywhere, they would like to have more goodies, they would like to have more resources, and this is the kind of thing that's actually very, very significant there. And so the point I would make, consequently, is that the post-9/11 period has seen not only that these agencies have grown yet again in size, in terms of budget, in terms of personnel, in terms of the scope of activity, the number of activities, but that when they've done so basically almost completely out of the public eye. It's never been debated. On the rare occasions that someone talks about it, of course, the same exact invective is used, you shouldn't be doing this. You may remember, it just happened just last week, that there was yet another doomed attempt by certain Republicans and certain Democrats in the Senate to see if they could repeal the so-called authorization for the use of military force. This was the resolution that was passed first after 9/11 and subsequently passed in a different form in order to permit Bush to go into Iraq. And it turns out that, of course, the AUMF was used originally with regard to Al-Qaeda. And no one is seriously claiming that all of the people that are currently being chased by U.S. Special Forces are Al-Qaeda. I would remind you, U.S. Special Forces are currently at work in, besides Afghanistan and Iraq, and a little bit in Syria. They're also at work in Yemen. They're at work in Somalia, as we now know, although Lindsey Graham didn't. They're at work in Niger and in Mali, and in the Philippines and a number of other places. And there are drones that are being flown. There are airstrikes that are being carried out. So this is becoming something that's very, very significant. So it turns out there's a very high level of activity, a level of activity that's been below the radar, that's never been debated. That's not the subject of any campaign speeches by any candidate. That's not even an issue, because it's not the case that the opposition, to use that kind of language, the government side and the opposition side are loggerheads. Actually, they're in complete agreement on this. You would be very hard-pressed to find any country where there's a significant number of members of the opposition who actually would dare to say that they don't think that the government, for example, should be spending more money on surveillance of, to use the American term, bad guys. That they don't think that there should be more drones that are built. That they don't think that there should be this or that. They could, of course, quibble about specific operations, but most of the time they don't quibble about it because they know it's a non-starter. Their constituents don't know. Their constituents don't really care. They know that they can easily be, to use another antique term, red-baited if they try to raise these kinds of things. And so consequently, what one has is that with the growth of these agencies, budget, number of people, number of agencies, scope, scale of activities, coordination, and so on and so forth, it goes pari passu with a lack of debate. So that these agencies, to a great degree, and this major change, that in my view is a really significant change that goes back at least to the end of World War II and its antecedents even before that, is the type of thing that escapes almost all kinds of democratic control. And so if you want, there are two ways that I would characterize this to finish up then. The first, and I think this is very significant, is that we can say that the growth of, if you will, the Garrison State or the national security state, or let's just simply say to be much more banal agencies having to do with war and peace and activities, that the growth of this is a black hole in democracy. It's a black hole. It's not just that no light gets out. It actually is a kind of attractive force because more and more things get sucked into that orbit. Need I remind you that Trump, and one might say, well, that's Trump because he has a particular set of fetishes. Trump has a number of former generals who are cabinet members or chiefs of staff and so forth, or his NSC advisor. I don't think we've ever had a situation like this before. But the use of the military, and the use of the military, for example, for ambassadorial purposes or to run other kind of agencies, is something that's actually very, very convenient. And while at this moment I'm willing to believe it's particularly American, it's not the kind of thing you get in other countries. Like many other bad things, it will probably spread from the US elsewhere there. Because one of the things that happens is that the US military has now institutionalized the idea that a general really should have at least a master's degree, or like David Petraeus, a PhD. And in that case, they appear to be really good at running things. Remember, if they run large organizations, and as many of them do have to engage in diplomacy, they're, to use a good French term, polyvalent, and they can do all kinds of things. And so this is what Lasswell called the rise of specialists of violence. And that's becoming significant. So you can say this is a black hole in democracy. But the other thing you can say, and this gets at it seems to me one of the really fundamental issues here, it's a kind of colonization of democratic life. It's a colonization of democratic life because any number of issues that used to be vigorously debated, that there was a range of opinions, that sometimes the state would win, sometimes the state would lose. There were things that would move in different directions there. At this point, if something is labeled as relevant, and not just labeled, it's not just a question of sticking a phrase on it, but is actually you have programs about it and agencies about it, it actually takes over in such a way that those areas now become kind of no-go zones. And so what one has is something that, if you kind of think of this epidemiologically, is actually very, very frightening. I'm not arguing, I want to make it clear, I'm not arguing that the kinds of things that were talked about earlier today, or that we will doubtless be continuing to talk about tomorrow, are irrelevant. I think they're highly relevant. But the point I want to get at is that those are at least on the radar screen. Whether we can do something about them is another question. What I'm talking about is something that's not even talked about. And in that particular case, the relative silence of any number of people who are concerned, ostensibly, who genuinely are, I believe them, about democracy and threats to democracy, on this, it mirrors the silence itself. So we have a kind of double silence. That's something, as I said, that I find extremely worrisome as a citizen as well as an intellectual, and I think I'll leave it at that. So thank you.
Thanks, David. You'll take a few questions.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So there we go, Andre. The very first question.
What is excellent talk. What is the connection between democracy and republics?
What's the what?
Sorry. What is the connection between democracy and republics?
So we have a literature, we have a tradition of thought about the threats to republics that are caused by war and preparations for war and standing armies. But that's usually considered as completely separate from threats to democracy. Indeed, many of the people, such as Madison, who were very concerned about threats to republics, were not, shall we say, the most democratic in their own beliefs, as was also pointed out earlier today. So part of what I wanted to try to do was to take that literature on war and standing armies as threats to republics, and as it were, first of all, talk about it more structurally in terms of organizations, because obviously at the time that Madison and people like this were writing, there were no organizations in this sense. And then secondly, apply it backward to democracy. So the issue, of course, for republics is that a republic would be characterized classically by the notion that it's something that's not a monarchy, not an autocracy, where a number of people are involved. It doesn't have to be democratic. There are any number of republics in human history that certainly did not involve the bulk of the population, or even the male population, or even the free male population, doing anything resembling voting, but you would still have aristocrats or landowners or so forth who would constitute some kind of a quasi-legislature and would engage in some kind of collective decision-making. Or if they had an executive, would be a check on the executive. The way, for example, if you think about Rome in terms of the Senate, the councils, and so forth. So the point is, that's something where we have this literature about this. On the other hand, we have a different kind of literatures about democracy, and as I said, the threats to democracy literature is almost entirely focused, at least up until recently, on threats about attitudes, about threats in competence, about notions of intolerance and so forth, which I agree are very real problems. I'm not trying to diminish them. So what I'm saying is that we can take some of this other literature, we can revise it, we can modernize it by talking about organizations and also talk about elite preferences and so forth, and we can feed it back into the thing on democracy.
Thank you for this splendid talk. To me, your talk at least resonates with another literature which is about permanent warfare, certainly in the last segment of your talk, the one that starts with, I'd say, the Gulf War, right, the 1990. I see it very much related to it, and a phenomenon that actually did not even start with Trump and populism, a phenomenon for which Hillary Clinton bears a great responsibility.
Absolutely.
So my question is, you did not pronounce the word once, permanent warfare, and I wonder if this is because you're actually pointing to something else, which has less to do with ideological choices, or...
It's an excellent question. I originally had to put a section in about warfare, but it tends to be highly differential. So there are some countries that are also afflicted by what I would call a garrison state, in which there are relatively few wars or almost no wars. Even then, they're susceptible because of notions of pulling their weight. You're part of the team, you should be doing this to participate. In fact, one of the things I was struck by in terms of this project I'm doing, we went and looked at parliamentary speeches in Japan at the time of the first Gulf War and in Germany, and what you really get on the case of the Japanese, it's fascinating, is the prime minister standing up before the Diet and saying, I find it dishonorable and shameful that we Japanese are not participating with our American allies in stopping this madman, okay? And he actually uses words with very strong political and cultural resonance in Japan, dishonorable and shameful. Okay? You find at the time of the first Gulf War also that Kohl in Germany appears acutely embarrassed about not being able, in terms of the politics of Germany at the time, to go any further. Okay? And then they find it particularly bad, especially in the case of Japan, that they're reduced to writing a check. And this is like the height of ignominy. Okay? And so the point I would get at is that, first of all, the reason I haven't been talking about permanent war is that it's true of some countries but not of others. It's actually true of more than we might realize. I mean, it's true of France as well as the United States as well as the United Kingdom to start with, but it's not true of all the others, okay? And so that's one reason. But secondly, because it raises a whole series of other questions. One of the defenses that people in the Garrison State have hid behind for a long time is they want to have their cake and eat it too. And so they want to say, for example, that what's going on in place X is not really warfare, right? So to go back to the Truman thing, remember what Truman called the Korean War? A police action, okay? Just, like there's a domestic disturbance and you send a few cops there, this kind of thing, right? It was a police action, and that's why he said he didn't have to get a vote of a declaration of war by Congress. And so it's very hard to know what we would even qualify these things. They clearly are wars, but the role is different. So for example, let's say we have one of the standard ways in which wars are fought these days on the part of the United States, besides the special forces, is through drones, as you all know. The typical drone, I'm not sure you're aware of this, where it's piloted from, is Las Vegas, which is, I think, really symbolic in lots of ways, right? There's air bases outside of Las Vegas. There's these nondescript metal air-conditioned shacks with a lot of high-tech equipment, and pilots will sit there with long days, right? In fact, they went on strike at one point because they said the day was too long, and they also wanted better chairs. I'm not joking, it's true, okay, and they will actually been hooked in by satellite for these kind of things. It is a video game thing, although apparently they also find that they themselves are traumatized by killing people. But is this a war? Well, it sure as hell is a war if you're there. Is it a war from the standpoint of the people in Washington? Of course they would say it's not a war. And I don't mean to get into the semantics of this. All I want to say is that you kind of opened up a can of worms with this, and that's why I was trying to avoid it, obviously not successfully, but anyway.
Okay.
Yes.
Fascinating story, or frightening story. I think I have a simple explanation, and you tell me what's wrong with the explanation. Okay. Well, all agencies want to grow. That is a law of nature, almost. But security agencies are specializing in producing non-events. Universities are specializing in producing events, right? Like PhDs per year. Security organizations produce non-events. So, namely, nothing happens. If something happens, there is the argument we have not invested enough. If nothing happens, they can take credit for it. The silence that you observe, the democratic silence, the non-voice surrounding this, is clearly motivated by one of the strongest driving forces of political agents, representative agents, and legislatures, which is blame avoidance. You do not want to be blamed if you oppose something. And something.
Absolutely.
And that's all that you need for this
It's not quite
bottomless hole.
Yeah, I think that does account, as we would say in statistics, with part of the variance, but not the whole thing. Because what I think it misses is the fact that some of what they do lots of things. And that's actually standard bureaucratic logic. If you go back to Herbert Simon and you go back to his notion of so-called subsystem dominance, what one has, because how does one measure security? Exactly because of things that haven't happened. Okay, no one was killed this year. There were no terrorist attacks this year. But the efforts are quantifiable. And the efforts will involve fighting, wars, or whatever one wants to call them. The efforts will involve so-called covert operations. The efforts will involve surveillance. For example, sheer numbers of people that one wiretaps or one puts on a no-fly list and so forth. And those are metrics which managers of organizations love. It justifies money. And the interesting thing, therefore, is that the silence is about stuff that they do. It's not just that nothing happens. It's that they do things, and then, a la Hume and constant conjunction, they have a difficulty. They have to actually try to demonstrate that because of what they do, these other kind of things didn't happen there. And the interesting thing is that what's really interesting is that members of parliament who are not known usually for being shy, and they're not known for avoiding the limelight, and they're not known for avoiding going into cameras and saying, I've done all these wonderful things, they have completely internalized how, in these contexts, one has to protect them, and protect them from the hoi polloi, protect them from the slings and arrows of outrageous, in this case, newspapers, if not fortune, and so forth. And so consequently, what happens is that the pernicious quality of the lack of debate is even clearer because these agencies are doing something. Okay, and it's only therefore when, as I said, there's a real screw up, when there's some kind of clear disaster, then they have to scapegoat. But even then, there's a massive attention to making sure that the inquiry is usually confined to certain, looking for certain kinds of scapegoats there. So, I mean, I agree with you. You're absolutely right. In one sense, nothing happens. But in another sense, there's an awful lot that does happen. You would imagine probabilistically that once in a while some congressman would just start, or some member of parliament would start saying, well, yes, we did these kind of things there. Because they couldn't all be secret. But they actually all toe the line to some degree. And then the other thing is there's a division of labor. So what they're really hoping is that, a la Disraeli's phrase, if they can climb to the top of the greasy pole, they too can be part of these executive briefings. They too can be one of the so-called Gang of Eight. They can be invited to go to the White House. They can actually read the top secret stuff. They can technically be consulted even if they have no illusions that their opinions are actually followed. And sufficient unto the day is for that, okay? So that's my point, is that there's a lot more buy-in by elites than you would imagine. And it also, by the way, works, although I didn't talk about this, it works as well for the news media. You get regular flattery attempts for elite news media, okay, whereby editors or occasionally publishers are wined or dined or given top secret off, hush-hush types of briefings about what's going on, and it works like a charm, okay? They almost never, send in stories that actually raise issues that they don't want to raise, so. Mm-hmm.
Sir, just a couple of comments to what you've been saying. It just happens that the subject is not...
You should say who you are so he knows who's asking the question.
Well...
Otherwise I will.
I happen to know a bit about the subject as such. There's some issues here that...
Okay.
There's some issues here which, in my opinion, would need you to shed light on them. And one of them is that you actually referred, and some of your points were absolutely valid. You referred actually to the quality of leadership, not exactly to what the agencies, may they be a few of them, a bunch of them, a huge host of them, would in the end do. Is the quality of leadership, which is extremely important. You referred to a double kind of silence. No, there's a multiple of narratives that address the work of agencies, and this is somehow normal because whatever is shrouded in secrecy would pretend a narrative, no matter whether it is closer to truth or as far as moon is from Earth, as far the truth, from the truth itself. Now, I completely agree with you with what was the, that fear is one of the mechanisms that put people in a position to enter a vicious circle of arguments. It's fear I have to be secure, and that belongs to the primary, let's say, levels of the Maslow pyramid. And if I need to be secure, there should be somebody or something that should, in a way, build security for me and protect me and my family and my community, etc., etc. Would people be ready to pay whatever necessary to have the feeling of security, at least, fundamentally or something? The answer nowadays is yes. You alluded to this, although I think that you are short an argument. And I come back now to what you've been saying. There have been several changes I would presume you're well aware of. First, in the passage after the First World War, due to the experiences of the war itself, from tactical intelligence to strategic intelligence, the very meaning of intelligence has changed. And it grew into a huge complex of meanings, which makes intelligence as easy to explain to people as one would attempt to explain what life is, which makes your task somehow impossible. But this is why I appreciate very much that you have opened the subject. The second, the need for intelligence. The question that was addressed in the early 20s, early 30s, and then with a fantastic power throughout the Second World War, when the OSS came into being, was what kind of intelligence do we need so that we can take off from what happens, take off from answers relating to the question, to the following question, what happens, to what will happen in a short time span, to the major question now intelligence is asked to answer, what should happen or what ought happen. You say that at a certain point that there's no real oversight. Well, yes, it might be the case. But legally, the oversight exists. And it's threefold. It's the parliamentary, it's the executive, it's the Court of Accounts in all countries, and there might be also a fourth layer of oversight, which is the legal oversight from within the agency itself. Now, coming back again, it's a matter of leadership. The oversight can be exercised by those who are apt enough to take aboard the challenge of, in legal terms, to look into the dark, murky matters of an agency. You said that there is a sort of tacit consensus at the level of a very small number of elite representatives. You're right. But what would you do with the secret then? Jokingly, you said that there are 800,000 employees, I don't know, for the agencies in the US.
It wasn't a joke, but yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and no, the joke was the question, the rhetoric question you address in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a way of preserving a secret? Yes. Because one of the most important laws of an agency is a so-called need-to-know law. And this is the reason why agencies are extremely compartmented. They have compartments for everything. And compartments do not work on horizontal level. They work through coordination. And this is the magic word within an agency. If coordination doesn't work, yeah, you might be right. There might be somebody who just go out in the public and say whatever he knows. That's the word. Coordination, nevertheless, is exercised by apt leadership. Now, coming back to the CIA. The CIA was and was not a product of the Second World War. A real product of the Second World War, in my opinion, was the OSS. When CIA came forth, for almost 10 years, the famous first 10 years of CIA, they could not, or it was a situation when the targets itself for intelligence gathering were quite unclear. And this is why in 10 years' time, the CIA grew from an amoeba to a huge mammal. And that was because the targets were not exactly politically swallowed and digested. And then, yes, there was a time when an agency like the CIA, in its childhood, could form its own subjects of work and deal with it accordingly. At a certain point, you said that the number of employees would stay the same in the agencies in general, or diminish with a tiny bit, and then grow at least to the same figure it was before. Yes and no. Indeed, in some countries, this is the process that happens, because agencies have their own, quote-unquote, social reasons of existence. But in general, it doesn't happen. The number of employees, unfortunately, is coming down. And why? Because intelligence is changing its contents. And there were, for 40 years, after the Second World War, what was important was human. That was the peak in employing individuals. After the 80s, what came as far more interesting than the human itself was the SIGINT. And that took the agencies through the dire straits of putting out a lot of experienced people. Now, they're coming back to human, and they're growing in staff again. It happens very much due to the very meaning of intelligence and to the very scope of intelligence gathering. Now, human and SIGINT go together. SIGINT, SATINT, comment as you went. They go together. So in a way, it's easier to technically use espionage than to use individuals for this. And budgetary is far more easier too. Now, after 1911, the magic word is adaptation. Are the agencies ready to adapt themselves to a new kind of threat, to a new kind of enemy? Maybe yes, maybe no. all of us were aware that the conflict between civil liberties, civil individual liberties, and the need of individual security has not been solved anyway. But on the other hand, would surveillance, individual surveillance, help the large global community stand against terrorism or defy terrorism? No, it's impossible. And what happened in Marseille or in Nice, in Paris, in London is a proof of this. This is actually the adaptation phase. What would come out of the adaptation phase would be again a problem addressing the leadership, not just the contents, the meaning of intelligence itself. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just make 2 or 3 points if I could. I'm sure I not only sure, I know I will not answer all of the issues you raised. First of all, about secrets and classification. Obviously, I don't have a security clearance, so I don't see current intelligence. I can tell you, being a fairly assiduous reader of archives, that when I see intelligence estimates or even fairly unredacted raw reports from the field from decades past that were finally declassified, I would agree completely with the late Senator Daniel Moynihan of New York, who said that 95% of what's classified. There's no reason whatsoever to be classified. And any number of people who used to actually work reading classified material would tell you something similar. It's widely accepted by large numbers of people in multiple countries that the classification system has gone way beyond Baroque and has become in full Rococo at this point, and that things are just classified for the sake of being classified. So first of all, I think I would skirmish with you about that. Secondly, about the CIA, the OSS, for the most part, was not really an intelligence gathering agency. The OSS was a bunch of knuckle draggers who actually carried out lots of sabotage and, of course, obviously bought some kinds of intelligence. We can go over specific details of people, including the mythical people like James Angleton and so forth about that. But the significant thing is that when the CIA was established, it was first of all housed indirectly in the State Department and then was made more autonomous. It was almost immediately given, and this is the important point from my perspective, it was given operational powers. It was not just gathering intelligence. The premise of a lot of your remarks is that intelligence agencies gather intelligence. Maybe. I can tell you a lot of other intelligence agencies do many, many other things. So the CIA its first great triumph was the rigging of the Italian elections in 1948. Okay, where they were handing out $100 bills like crazy to cardinals and archbishops, as well as to various kinds of politicians, and handing money out, by the way, that continued up until the 1960s, where they had radio broadcasts, where they had all kinds of people from newspapers on their payroll, doing everything they possibly could to make sure that the Italians voted the right way. That's a so-called covert action that has only the most tangential connection with intelligence. Second operation the CIA carried out was Operation BG Fiend, okay, which is repeated attempts to send frogmen ashore on rubber dinghies into Albania to, as they thought it, overthrow the Enver Hoxha regime. As you remember, that didn't actually happen. One of the reasons it didn't happen was that the famous James Angleton, his counterpart for the planning of these operations was Kim Philby. Okay, so that tells you all you need to know about the CIA's lack of success, but they kept doing the same kind of thing. And this is standard Herbert Simon, Carnegie Mellon, Sired March kind of thing, which is that it's subsystem dominant. Okay? You do what you can. You do what's appropriate, not what actually works. And so they did a lot of things that were appropriate that didn't actually work. So I would fundamentally disagree that one of the key aspects of intelligence agencies is actually the gathering or the processing or the analysis of intelligence. Of course it is, but that's not the principal thing. And certainly the big growth of the CIA in recent years has had nothing to do with that. It's had almost everything to do with paramilitary operations of different sorts. Third and final point, just as a general issue. Obviously, as a political scientist, we're trained to do structural analyses, and so I don't believe that leadership is of very much significance. I think that's a kind of residual category, and I'd be happy to go over lots of specific so-called leaders of the CIA or of other agencies and go back and forth with you on that, but not now. On the other hand, what I would say, let's say for the sake of argument you're correct, that it really is a question of leadership and that we have this anguishing dilemma between doing these secret things, okay, on the one hand, and on the other hand, some hypothetical accountability. By the way, I think it's completely hypothetical. It doesn't actually mean anything. Let's say you're right. What that says, in effect, is that whole swaths of our democratic life have been confiscated or put over in a different form that the public doesn't know about, that's not discussed, that's not debated. That is to say, by definition, it's not democratic. So now we have the very people who supposedly are keeping us safe who are not subject to any kind of democratic control. That, to me, is an oxymoron. Okay.
Thank you, David.
Certainly, we won't go into arguments, in contradicting each other. With all the deference possible, you'll find the pocket and I'm very sorry. But there are some issues here, at least. Yes, you mentioned two of the operations, two of the incipient CIA operations. There weren't just the two, and we know, I hope, the case. But it is indeed a matter of leadership. Why? Because none of the agencies would take over itself its tasks asserted or built within the agency without having at least without having a political backing, well, at least theoretically. If there is no political leadership addressing the work of an agency, the agency would not work. It's an agency. It's on the passive side of political order. It's not on the active side of the political order. There are plenty of examples when agencies have trespassed this theoretical line I'm trying to describe, indeed. But there were learned lessons afterwards. Second, I think it's gathering intelligence, which is the most important task of an agency. Otherwise, how could one go into operations without having, prior to organizing an operation, the due intelligence needed? This is why this is why they came into being, and this is why they function. What comes afterwards, that is the executive operations, that's a product of gathered intelligence, analyzed intelligence, and then political decision. So in the end, it comes back to leadership. Thank you.
Gregoire, I think you had your hand up before.
Thank you very much, David, for that talk. I think actually I wanted to push you to reflect on two actors that were missing in your story and that are particularly present in the famous Eisenhower speech about the military-industrial complex, which is also behind the theory of the Garrison State. And it's the industry and the experts. In your talk, we don't see the industrial complex, which has moved from the nuclear to the missile industry to the software industry, which has a different type of relationship to congressmen and to local jobs that congressmen may indeed be fearful to see leave their jurisdiction. But it's a different fear than the fear that you've been talking about. Right. And here, maybe I would have liked to know exactly how in your big narrative you include these the economic interest into your story of the buy-ins. Is it revolving doors, sort of hopes of monetary gains, etc., at the individual level? So that's for the first thing, because I don't believe that in the strong association that you make between fear and the collective action, which would be the parliamentary class. I think it's more complex. will not be surprised, being a sociologist, that I think it's going to be more complex. The second thing where it's going to be about the same, which is it's going to be more complex, it's about the whole narrative of the removal of knowledge as the one mechanism that threatens the democratic debate. Here, I also think that maybe things have changed. Indeed, with the nuclear age, it's famous. The removal of knowledge massively works actually to prevent debate. The Manhattan Project budget was hidden in the congressional appropriations, etc. Now, I think we're actually, as you said, when we look at what is classified information, we find that it's not that different from unclassified information.
Exactly.
And so we actually are in a proliferation of knowledge. And now knowledge actually works, ignorance actually works more by killing intelligence by the accumulation of knowledge. And what these security clearances that you're talking about do, it's not that they remove knowledge. The knowledge is there. But those people in the government can't talk about it, even though if it's public, because they signed a contractual agreement, they can't talk about it, because you could say on one side they are talking about public knowledge, but on the other side, they are also talking about classified knowledge about which they are not authorized to talk. So I would, and a lot of knowledge also, as Eisenhower well knew when he was fighting the race, and when he was not fighting the race, but when he was fighting in the missile debate, the expertise of the Rand Corporation, a lot of knowledge that is produced publicly falls under the philosophical category of bullshit, which is a public knowledge upon which there's no criteria to ascertain whether it's true or not. So on that, I would also like to know if you see shifts rather than continuities in the way management of knowledge actually threatens our democratic debate.
Okay, those are two very, very nice points. Let me just try to address the first quickly and spend a little bit more time on the second. Obviously, industry does play a role, but much more in the kind of standard political economy sense as to how certain kind of contracts get let, how certain kind of contracts continue, and so forth. It is worth noting, and I was going to mention this before, that there is this very significant degree of outsourcing that goes on right now. And one of the things that happens, we've seen this for decades with generals and colonels and admirals and captains, but it also works at the level of spooks, whereby people, after they put their years in and can get their pension, then go to work for a private company, often a defense contractor, or they set up basically the same operation they'd been doing under government employ. Now it's outsourced. And for reasons I've never quite understood, this goes back to Reagan and actually Al Gore, there was this notion that this is supposed to be more efficient. I never figured out how it's supposed to be more efficient, but there's a lot of outsourcing. By the way, this works at other countries. It works at the United Nations. Okay, the idea is that if we can do it for the state, let's do it privately instead, even if it costs more money. So I agree, that's part of it. I don't think it necessarily plays an independent role. I think it's the kind of a revolving door. I think this thing of experts is interesting. I mean, I would first of all start by adding for your list, if you will, of the kind of murderer's row. Some of my favorite examples are, for example, Michigan State University, which with Project Camelot and the advising of the US government for South Vietnam in the 1960s was quite infamous. MIT, with some, quote, good guys like Bill Kaufman and a number of bad guys and so forth, having to do with nuclear targeting. There's lots and lots of cases of experts there. However, what I guess I would say, apropos of what you were saying, is that to my way of thinking, this is dotted line arguments. One of the things I did a few years ago, I did a little study because I kept running into someone like a guy like Steve Walt at conferences and saying, why isn't the work we do more relevant? And I said, I don't understand why you think it's not relevant, because half the people in the US government have PhDs in international relations, okay? He said, no, it's not relevant, they don't listen to us. So I went and looked at, I came up with a sample of about 100 studies produced in think tanks. To be sure, they were non-classified studies, so I might have missed the real gems. I doubt it, but I might have. And I then tracked them. And as they went further up the ladder, higher and higher into the inner circles, they dropped out. And at the very top level, principals meetings and meetings at the Oval Office or in the cabinet room and so forth, they were never referred to. And not just they were never referred to as a study, nobody even made what I would call consequentialist arguments. For example, the last 10 times we did such and such, it failed, so let's not do it again. They don't even make those arguments at that level. And when I then started interviewing people, why don't you make the arguments? And they said, because it's a brainless argument. I said, what do you mean? It's best quality social science. They said, no. It's because the answer is, and this is my version now, not theirs, it's the Mr. Micawber thing from the Pickwick Papers. Something might always turn up. Maybe this time it'll be different. Sure, the last 10 times when we sent the guys in on rubber boats, it didn't work. But the 11th time, if we send them to a different beach, it might work. And besides, it's the only game in town. So my point would be, they're dotted line arguments. A lot of expertise, whatever you think of it in social science terms, is dotted line. And so I would refer to the work in org theory, in your field, okay, the famous garbage can model, okay, about streams that come together. And what you get is a completely opportunistic use of intelligence or expertise along with whichever current star of the bureaucracy happens to be available for a job, whatever the current problem of the day is. And so the classic example, the absolute classic example of this, so you could actually take it in a textbook, right, is the way that over the summer of 2001, you had George Tenet, the head of the CIA, pushing through the bureaucracy the idea of helping the Northern Alliance. Ahmed Shah Massoud in Afghanistan. That's what they wanted to do. Okay, they were going to push this through. And there were a whole lot of people in the Bush administration who didn't care at all about this. He finally was able to lobby his peers and so forth and get it to Condoleezza Rice. And she agreed that she would make a recommendation that this plan be followed. She dusted it, she took it and she wrote a memo, she put it on Bush's desk. That was a day and a half before the events of 9/11. The next day, Ahmed Shah Massoud was assassinated. Then the events of 9/11 occurred. And a few days later, Bush had a meeting at Camp David. And this is what's really interesting from a sociological point of view. So, Tenet knows that Rumsfeld will not propose something about sending troops because he doesn't like the idea of sending troops to Central Asia and to land wars and so forth. He's learned the lessons from Vietnam. Tenet knows he has a free rein. He literally takes his report that he lobbied through during the summer, tears off the title page, puts a new title page on which consists of a picture of Osama bin Laden with a big X, red X through it. The identical report, word for word the same. He doesn't change the page numbering, he doesn't change the section headings, he doesn't change anything at all. Puts it there and says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to recruit the Northern Alliance. Left unsaid, of course, is, with large pallets of $100 bills. Okay, we'll recruit the Northern Alliance, and that's what we'll do. And because that was the only game in town, Bush did it. At no point was there a discussion, would this work? As it worked in the past? All that was left was to say, for people like Wolfowitz, whom I'm ashamed to say was a political scientist, that, well, probably Saddam Hussein was really behind this. So why not attack Iraq instead? Okay, so the point I'm getting at is that expertise, the point going into your story, the expertise in this case, expertise works as a dotted line argument. I'm not saying that we, if we were looking at it after the fact, would necessarily say that all of the reports are nonsense. I'm sure many of them are actually lucidly argued and may well be based on solid evidence. So I'm not saying that. But there's no evidence that I've seen that anywhere in the policy community at the highest levels that anybody really cares about effectiveness. There's a few exceptions to that having to do, for example, with command and control. If you think of Steinbrenner's work on nuclear war, there's a few things like this about, for example, the work on the ABM treaty and things like that. But for the most part, I would say 98 to 99% of the policy debates do not revolve around expertise. What they revolve around is, let's take the existing organizations that we have. The existing capabilities, let's say which one is, to use a kind of good Heideggerian term, ready at hand, that we can actually kind of put into place right now, okay, that's not going to rock the boat, that we can do easily, and that will appear to do something, okay? That's what appears to happen. And that's why, therefore, whether these things are staffed out or not is almost irrelevant. And indeed, the more that you build these organizations up, the easier it becomes subsequently to take, for them to have these outputs that continue over and over again. So that's a lengthy answer to your question, but I like the question, so anyway.
I've got the mic.
I have two people who...
Sorry.
Okay, sure.
Are you okay? I mean, you've been standing up there talking for...
No, it's fine.
Okay, great. I'm not a political scientist or a sociologist, so
much the better for you.
Okay. I'm more of a journalist, so my focus is more on the nuts and bolts. And like you, I suspect the Snowden case is fascinating, not just for the intelligence that it revealed, but the things that it revealed about the way the system works.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to challenge you on the point you said about parliamentarians having the ability, at least in theory, to withdraw funding from these agencies or these operations. Because as I recall, before Snowden, there were a couple of senators, I want to say Wyden and Udall, but you may know the names better than me, who did make consistent efforts to find out, based on small amounts of information that had been revealed, about what the NSA was doing.
Absolutely.
And they were consistently stonewalled and given completely non-factual information, i.e. lies.
Absolutely.
But the point was that even though they were elected, they had, it seems, no right to access any of this information.
But that's because they didn't control the legislative wing.
Yeah.
We can do a counterfactual. Had they had a number of other members of Congress, in this case, on their side, they would have been able to force things.
Yeah.
Okay? They have lots of powers. They just don't want to use them. Even during the Vietnam War, it took almost forever for Congress to do almost anything in terms of cutting off funds. Okay? Because it's a very dangerous position. You remember when Nancy Pelosi tried to cut off, well, she didn't really try, it was fake, to cut off funds after 2006. And the Republicans had this absolutely ridiculous argument, my God, the troops will be left in the desert without any weapons, without any food, they'll die in the desert. And I said, no, that's not really what we're proposing, but they let themselves be mau-mau'd this way. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, the only point I was going to make was that it's a very brave parliamentarian who pursues this strategy in the face of the kind of pressures you've just described.
Exactly.
When they don't have access to any information, not just parts of it, but any of it. I mean, they had no information, information. But following on from Snowden, we're almost 5 years now on from those revelations. Has anything changed? I mean, has the public attitude changed? Has the attitudes of Congress or the oversight bodies changed?
A little bit. Yeah. Not a lot has changed. A little bit has changed. There have been a few things where there were some sunset provisions in some of the FISA Act legislation. We'd have to talk about the specific things, a little bit about some of the warrants. They did succeed in sunsetting it, and they did succeed in getting an issue debated for the first time. The media didn't do very much coverage, but it was almost the kind of the Dr. Johnson thing about, the dog walking and so forth. And so in that sense, it was interesting because it was the first time that anyone can recall that these issues actually got debated. It's quite possible, given the likely hecatomb among Republicans in next year's election, that the survivors will be disproportionately Tea Party members. And in that case, you might even get more of these, because some of these people, like Justin Amash from Michigan and so forth, are really true believers, kind of small L libertarians and so forth. I wouldn't count on it, but it's possible. I have a former student of mine who's working in Berlin right now studying what he would call non-oversight by the German Bundestag of the BND and so forth. And he says there are particular circumstances in which if the stars align, you might get something happening, but not to hold your breath. But I agree. I mean, you remember that when was it Cameron proposed the so-called Snoopers Charter? There was a flurry of discussion about it. Then, of course, it subsided very quickly. In France, the renewal of the état d'urgence has led to some discussion. So it's not that it never happens. It's usually contained. Okay, and if it looks like it's getting out of control, that's when the big guns are brought in. It's like, you really don't want to do this. This is really bad for your career and so forth. And then at that point, they usually fold. So, sorry.
No, it's getting late. Maybe just quick comments on some of the things that were said. I agree with the question on the point on leadership. I think it does matter a lot in many ways in terms of the currency that we see impacting how intelligence works itself. And if you look at the continuity between, say, the military-industrial complex period, Eisenhower, JFK's leadership, which was becoming problematic to the CIA just a few weeks before his assassination, as you know, in the nature of the leadership that Johnson subsequently adopted. I think that is something that speaks a lot to how these institutions function and how they adapt and find their place within the society. The other thing is also, I do think that the CIA's history, in many ways, in the early days, in the period that you covered, is politically, I think you said something about the fact that they were able to choose their own object of work, and I think in that sense we see, he said that. I think you see fundamentally a selection of operations, and you mentioned a few around the world where those operations were essentially defining how they were going to function in the next couple of decades as such. Now, so I think there's certainly continuity, but I would agree with you what happens after 9/11 and the Dana Priest work, which is already a good 10, 12 years ago now. I think a lot has happened since. The expansion of what's been happening, and I think we barely, have a sense of where this is heading in terms of the invisibility of these operations, the steady patterns, and not in a conspiratorial sense, in a factual sense, as you presented it. I think this, to link it to our discussion here on democracy, for me raises the question not so much of the expertise, which is very much incestuous. The fellows that you mentioned, and they tend to be fellows, maybe except for Condi, is very much something that is back and forth. It's not even expertise. The memo that Bush is given on August 6th says specifically, bin Laden determined to strike in the United States. I mean, how much more explicit can you be 6 weeks before 9/11? So it's not really expertise as much as data that is provided, but no decision is taken on it. But what happens afterwards is that you see the rise of terrorism experts sociologically playing this game when there's a conveyor belt to the rest of society. This is where we are right now. And what's going to happen in the next phase, as we see the patterns, is that the democratization of this is raising questions very much about how the societies, and not just in the US, as we were discussing upstairs, I think this has gone global now. And the footnote in your paper that you mentioned speaks to how Patriot Act is being used more and more. As this is going global, the nature of the societies that we will see very much is not resting only on the decision makers whom we can finger point and indicate the shortcomings there, but very much about the types of choices that people are making within those societies. What the Priest first couple of pages that you wrote explicitly, vividly points out to, is that people are looking for opportunities right after 9/11, jobs that would give them the possibility of acting like these super secret agents, which is nonsensical. Indeed, 1 million James Bonds, that doesn't mean anything. But I think to finish, it raises the question about the quality of the democracies, or societies even, not just democracies, that we're going to have.
So I mean, I'm just going to make one comment about this because it's late. I guess what I would say is that I mean, I don't see this as democratic. I see it as profoundly antithetical to democracy. And the one thing I can see, because I'm in academia, and you were alluding to this, is the so-called terrorism experts. There's a whole terrorism industry now. Okay? There are, and I'm horrified by this as an academic, there are actual universities offering degrees in terrorist studies, which is, you could think they might have named it a little bit differently, right? And of course, but the intellectual content is close to zero. But it's worse than that, because the idea is that, okay, we're going to train people so that they can actually get a job in this. And in that particular sense, there was no vote on this. I mean, obviously, this is autonomous decisions by universities, right? Nobody forced them to do this. I'm not saying it should be a matter of a vote. But the point is, this is what I mean about colonizing everyday life. It colonizes our society in all kinds of ways, that we now have so-called terrorist studies majors, and that there are terrorism journals, okay? Just as some decades before, remember, we small wars and insurgencies journals and things like this. that tells you about what's actually happening. So the academia is we are in it at least up to our necks. And I'll leave it on that helpful note. Thank you.